a vibrant and charismatic individual, blessed with extraordinary intellect. Steve Biko faced the hardships of fighting against apartheid in his brief life, which ended tragically. More than just a revered figure in Black consciousness, delving deeper into his life reveals a complex and, in some ways, unexpected philosophy from this African hero. Born in 1946, in a South Africa marred by segregation and under the oppressive rule of Dutch and later British colonizers, Stephen Biko faced adversity from an early age. He was just 4 years old when his father passed away, leaving his mother to single-handedly navigate the challenges of raising a family under difficult circumstances. Raised within the cultural framework of Xhosa traditions and Anglican Christianity, Biko underwent the Owoloko rite of passage at 18, marking his transition into adulthood through circumcision. An outstanding student, Biko joined his brother Kaya at Lovedale, a prominent educational institution. There, he began to develop an affinity for the Pan-African Congress, an organization committed to the empowerment and affirmation of Black and African identities. However, both brothers faced arrest under suspicion of involvement with the armed wing of the party. Although they were later acquitted, they were expelled from Lovedale. Considering a career in law, Biko found himself swayed by the concerns of his close circle regarding his escalating political activism. Consequently, he opted for what was viewed as the safer path, pursuing medical studies instead. In 1966, at the age of 20, Steve Biko entered the University of Natal in Durban on a scholarship, attending the segregated non-European section of the institution. During this time, anti-apartheid activism within the student community was largely led by progressive whites, a fact that initially led Biko to consider broader alliances. However, he soon came to realize that even well-intentioned whites often displayed a paternalistic attitude. They seemed eager to dictate the goals, methods, and timeline of the Black liberation struggle, a perspective Biko found to be rooted in the same sense of racial superiority harbored by overtly racist whites. Biko observed that these progressive whites were unwilling to relinquish the privileges their skin color afforded them in the name of the Black struggle. He argued that if they were genuinely committed to ending apartheid, their efforts should focus on dismantling the racist systems that upheld their privileges, rather than assuming a condescending leadership role over Black activists. He was particularly critical of their tendency to label Black-led organizations as racist when they were excluded from them, viewing such exclusion as a personal affront to their intellectual superiority. Doesn't this remind you of the attitude of liberal whites in the civil rights movement in America? White liberals were the leaders of the NAACP, for example. For Biko, the first hurdle to overcome in the quest for liberation was the Black community's own psychological conditioning, an inferiority complex, self-doubt, and fear that served as fertile ground for exploitation. It was this insight that led him to coin the phrase that remains his most well-known utterance: "The most potent weapon in the hand of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed." He believed that this mental subjugation was a significant obstacle in the fight for freedom, and tackling it was essential for meaningful progress in the anti-apartheid struggle. Steve Biko articulated that the core principle of Black consciousness is the rejection of any value system that alienates Black people in their own homeland and undermines their inherent human dignity. The aim of Black consciousness, according to Biko, is to reignite a sense of pride in being Black and African, preparing individuals for the struggle for liberation. He emphasized that South Africa is, fundamentally, an African country and that its cultural and social landscape should reflect its African identity as the dominant narrative. Biko identified several key factors contributing to the erosion of Black pride, which needed to be addressed for liberation to be meaningful. 1. Biko criticized the presentation of Black history as one that portrayed Black people as uncivilized and incapable from the beginning of time, thus damaging their self-esteem and sense of worth. 2. He pointed out that European languages often reinforce negative stereotypes about Black people, associating them with all things bad or inferior. 3. According to Biko, Christianity had been used as a tool to subjugate Blacks, while indigenous African spirituality was stigmatized and dismissed as irrational superstition by the dominant culture. 4. Biko lamented that indigenous black culture had been suppressed, its values and norms replaced by Western standards that further marginalized black identities. 5. He criticized prevailing beauty norms that upheld whiteness as the ideal, thereby instilling a sense of inferiority among black individuals who came to view themselves as unattractive. In addressing these issues, he sought to create a foundation upon which black people could build their own sense of self-worth, free from the limiting beliefs and value systems imposed by a racially biased society. Steve Biko believed that the revival and celebration of black history and culture were crucial steps toward empowering the black community. He aimed to transform perceptions by asserting the beauty inherent in blackness, redefining the term black in a positive light, and reclaiming the true essence of African spirituality. Moreover, he called for a reevaluation of how Christianity had been used as a tool to oppress black people. At the core of the black consciousness movement was the philosophy of self-reliance. Captured in Biko's statement, "Black man, you are on your own," this sentiment emphasized the need for the black community to take full and independent control of their struggle against apartheid. The idea was to assume full ownership of the liberation movement, without the paternalistic oversight often offered by well-meaning whites. Biko posited that liberation is, first and foremost, a mental endeavor. It starts with addressing the psychological barriers that have held the black community back, limiting their ability to fully realize their potential. But he also recognized that liberation had economic dimensions. He advocated for a form of black economic communalism as a means to achieve not just psychological but also material independence. While Biko maintained amicable relationships with progressive white leaders, he deliberately kept them outside the organizational structure of the BCM. In contrast, the movement was inclusive of individuals from the colored and Indian communities. This nuanced approach underscored Biko's belief that the fight against apartheid had to be a predominantly black and African-led struggle, where the community could set its own agenda and define its own path toward liberation. In 1969, at the young age of 23, Steve Biko co-founded the South African Students' Organization, SASO, a union focused on black students. Just 2 years later, the organization adopted its manifesto, articulating the principles of black consciousness, the ideological framework guiding SASO's mission. At only 25 years old, Biko's compelling eloquence and intellectual acumen made a significant impact. SASO concentrated on education campaigns aimed at the psychological upliftment of black people. One of its rallying cries, articulated by Biko himself, was the simple yet profound statement, "Black is beautiful." The organization quickly gained traction across South African university campuses. Biko, who often penned his ideas under the pseudonym Frank Talk, became a leading figure in the fight against apartheid through his involvement in SASO. His focus on mental liberation and empowerment, particularly among students, established SASO as a pivotal force in the anti-apartheid movement, setting the stage for a new generation of black and African leaders committed to dismantling systemic racism from both a psychological and material standpoint. In 1973, the South African authorities labeled the Black Consciousness Movement, BCM, as a threat. Steve Biko faced a host of repressive measures. He was accused of terrorism, placed under house arrest, and even had his home targeted in a shooting. Despite these constraints, Biko found ways to communicate with the outside world and continued to serve as a central theorist in the anti-apartheid struggle. He actively raised funds for the construction of health centers and nurseries, offered aid to political prisoners, and helped finance scholarships. The situation reached a tipping point in 1976 when the government, influenced by the legacy of Dutch colonization, attempted to impose Afrikaans as the primary language of instruction in black schools. This move ignited widespread outrage. On June 16, 1976, backed by the BCM, an estimated 20,000 black students from Soweto took to the streets in protest. The response from white police was brutal. Between 176 and 700 people, most of whom were children and adolescents, were killed. This tragic event catalyzed what became known as the Soweto uprising, sparking chaos and unrest across the nation. The government's repression of BCM members intensified in the aftermath of the uprising, but the events had a galvanizing effect. The Soweto uprising became a seminal moment in the anti-apartheid struggle, bringing international attention to the plight of Black South Africans and adding urgency to their calls for equality and justice. In a tragic culmination of relentless harassment, Steve Biko was arrested on June 18, 1977, in Cape Town for violating the terms of his house arrest. He was subsequently taken to a facility in Port Elizabeth where he endured unspeakable torture. He suffered brutal beatings that led to extensive physical injuries, including a massive brain hemorrhage and kidney failure. Eventually slipping into a coma, Biko was transported on a 12-hour journey to Pretoria Central Prison without any medical attention. He was left, naked and unattended, on the floor of his prison cell, where he died the following day on September 12, 1977. He was only 31 years old. Biko's death resonated deeply, not only in South Africa but around the world. An estimated 20,000 people attended his funeral, marking it as the first mass funeral that the country would witness from that point until the end of apartheid. The tragedy of his death galvanized the anti-apartheid movement, bringing renewed attention and urgency to the fight for racial equality and justice in South Africa. His life, though cut short, left an indelible impact on the struggle against apartheid and continues to serve as an enduring symbol of resistance and empowerment. Indeed, the portrayal of Steve Biko often focuses on the more dramatic aspects of his life, his youth, charisma, and tragic death. While these elements are undoubtedly significant, they risk overshadowing the true depth of his intellectual contributions to anti-apartheid thought and Black empowerment.